Hello. So, this is a lecture on Immanuel Kant, specifically on the categorical imperative. So, as was discussed before, Kant's ethics is called deontology. So, deontology, as what has been said, comes from the Greek word deon, which means being necessary. In other words, it is about the study of duty or obligation. So, it was also mentioned last time that the focus of the ontology is on the rational will of the human being. And this rational will is autonomy. In other words, it is self legislating, it has its own principles of action. And we can understand further what autonomy is by relating it to the opposite of it, which is heteronomy. So heteronomy is uh, the principle of imposing laws and regulations on others, just like parents telling the children on what to do and what not to do. While autonomy is more on the subjective will, but that will be understood later on as something ethical when we apply what Kant calls categorical imperative. Okay? So this is the central of Kant's deontology. This is the central of the ethics of Kant. So this can be found on his work called The Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. So Immanuel Kant on categorical imperative. So first, we have to understand that even if it is autonomous, rational will is sometimes can be regarded, no? Some can be regarded as something opposite to that of the others. And to have a sense of universality or universalizability, we have to figure out how we can proceed to the so-called universalizability. So to figure out how the faculty of reason can be the cause of an autonomous action, we need to learn a method or a specific procedure that will demonstrate autonomy of the will. But before explaining this procedure, it will be helpful to first distinguish the kinds of moral theories. These are so-called the substantive moral versus formal moral theories. So a substantive moral theory, I apologize for the typo, substantive moral theory immediately promulgates the specific actions that comprise that theory. As such, it identifies the particular duties in a straightforward manner that the adherents of the theory must follow. Example, the Ten Commandments of the Judeo-Christian tradition. The specific laws are articulated mostly in the form of a straightforward moral command, right? The Ten Commandments. And we can actually divide it into two main, two main commandments. The first three is about God, concerning God, and the commandments 4 to 10 are about the others, or in other words, neighbors. So, to be specific, this is an example of a substantive moral theory precisely because it straightforwardly commands the person. For example, honor your father and your mother. and you shall not kill. Isn't it? It's very straightforward. It's like heteronomy in a sense, because it's legislating. The church is legislating this on its members. On the other hand, a formal moral theory does not supply the rules or commands straight away. Does not tell you what you may or may not to do. Does not tell you what you may or may not do. So rather, it provides us the form. That's why it's formal moral theory. It provides us the form or framework of the moral theory. In other words, to supply a procedure and the criteria for determining on one's own the rules and moral commands. So this is like a cookbook, metaphorically speaking. A cookbook has instructions on how to cook something, on how to cook a certain viand, a certain food. And by following those instructions, we arrive at a certain um, goal, an aim. However, in the instructions, we can add variations. In other words, you can still revise, but at the end of the day, it will still be the same variant. So a formal moral theory will not give us a list of rules or commands, but will give us a set of instructions on how to make a list of duties or moral commands. So the categorical imperative is endorsed by Kant. And this is a kind of formal moral theory. So the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, which is written by Kant in 1785, embodies a formal moral theory in what Kant calls the categorical imperative, which provides a procedural way of identifying the rightness or wrongness of an action. So for Kant, categorical imperative is one only, but he made variations of it. He made certain formula. So the first formula of this, and this is the uh, what he identifies as the only categorical imperative. But then again, uh, it has some variations to be specific, to be easier understood, to be applied by individuals easily. So the first formula, which is the formula of universal law, it says, act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. We will try to explain this first formula. So there are four key elements in this formulation of the categorical imperative, namely action, maxim, will, and universal law. So Kant states that we must formulate an action as a maxim. A maxim for Kant is a subjective principle of action. A subjective principle of action. So in this context, a maxim consists of a rule that we live by in our day-to-day lives. But it does not have the status of a law or a moral command that binds us to act in a certain way. So maxims depict the patterns of our behavior. Hence, maxims are akin to the standard operating procedures or what we call SOPs in our lives. We act according to a variety of maxims even if we are not aware of them. So we can actually know our maxims We can reveal them when we talk about ourselves, and we reveal our habits and the reasons behind our habits. For example, um, and I think this is pretty normal for students, especially those who are very stressed. During weekends, you take some time off your study, and some people who are working, they take some time off from work. And sometimes during weekends, they go to the beach, they go to the mall, or any other leisure activity, some recreational activity. So that is a maxim. Or for example, it is exam week, and your maxim during exam week is that you go to hear mass daily, and you pray daily the Holy Rosary. So those are types of maxims. So maxims, in other words, are personal policies that may or may not be unique to us, but we act according to these maxims nonetheless. Hence, Kant calls a maxim a subjective principle of action. Again, maxims are a subjective principles of action. So, in the formulation of the categorical imperative, Kant calls our attention to the kind of maxims that we live by. He claims that we ought to act according to the maxim through which you can, at the same time, will, the rational will, that it become a universal law. We will try to explain that. So, what does it mean to will a maxim that can become a universal law? So, it means that the maxim must be universalizable. Universalizable. This means nothing other than imagining a hypothetical world in which the maxim or personal policy or rule that I live by were adopted by everyone as their own maxim. So in this formulation, Kant is telling us to conceive of the maxim as if it obligated everyone to comply. So he gives us an example of making false promises, the issue of making false promises. So Kant narrates the predicament of a man who needs money but has no immediate access to obtain it except by borrowing it from a friend. So this man knows that he will not be able to pay the money back, but he borrows it from his friend nonetheless. So let's go to the imaginative hypothetical world. If borrowing money without intending to pay were everyone's maxim or obligation to comply with, what would happen to the status of the universalized maxim? The purpose of borrowing money would be defeated because then no one will lend money. This is somewhat akin. Have you noticed? This categorical imperative is somewhat likened or akin, has some similarities to the universal standard or golden rule. Do unto others what you would have them do unto you. But Kant formulates it in a very specific way. He wants us to have the notion of rational will, that all of us have these maxims as well, and that these maxims, and if we can have our rational will, that it become a universal law. Okay, so I think that's where Kant lies. That's where the difference lies between Kant and this golden rule of do unto others what you would have them do unto you. So the act of borrowing money without intending to pay is rationally impermissible. It is important to note that the two ways by which Kant rejects maxims So the universalized maxim becomes either self-contradictory, which is the contradictory of false promises, for example, or the act and its purpose become impossible. When it false promises are everybody's maxim, it will become impossible because no one will be lending money anymore. So, hence, what we get from this, again, no, this is what Kant rejects. How Kant rejects maxims. There are two ways how Kant rejects maxims. That is when the maxim is self-contradictory or the act and its purpose become impossible. In other words, for example, making false promises. So what we get from this, hence, is that rational permissibility of actions, that there is no contradictory, and that the act and its purpose become possible, and hence rational permissibility of actions is needed for the universalizability of maxim, by which they cannot be rejected. So, as I was saying a while ago, there are certain formula of the categorical imperative. It is only one. Categorical imperative is only one, which is the first formula. However, Kant formulates different varieties of it, variants of it, in order to be more specific for human actions. So the variant of the first formula is also called the formula of the law of nature. So act as if the maximum of your action were to become through your will a universal law of nature. In other words, for Kant, beings, what he uses as term is the term beings, not only and he distinguishes us from other beings because we are rational. Hence, he's somewhat akin to being an environmentalist, for example. In other words, we are not the only beings here. We are the irrational beings, but we are not the only beings. And for our actions to become, a universal law, it must also conform to the law of nature, to the other animals, to the other beings. And hence, since we are the rational beings, we must be on top of them. In other words, we must be the one who take care of them. And we must be the one who will, preserve nature. In other words, the second formula of the categorical imperative is called the formula of humanity as end in itself. Act so that you use humanity as much in your own person as in the person of every other, always at the same time, as end and never merely as means. In other words, when we look at other people as means, we in other words we're just using them for our end. In other words, we're just using them for a certain goal. And what Kant is trying to tell us is that our maxim could be a universal law only if when we look at other people always as an end and never merely as means. For example, you have a friend and you want his help for a certain project that you are trying to do, and you try to include him, not only to use his skills, you know, but to really include him in the process. And at the end of and at the end of your project, both of you will benefit from it. If only you will benefit from it, You only use him as a means to your own project. Okay? Third formula, which is called the formula of autonomy. So the idea of the will of every rational being as a will-giving universal law, or not to choose otherwise than so that the maxim of one's choice are at the same time comprehended with it in the same volition as universal law. This is somewhat, again, akin to the first formula. In other words, the sense of autonomy. You must also think that every rational being has a will, a certain will, a rational will by which their maxim can become a universal law. And this one has its own variant also. The formula of the realm of ends. To be specific, to be more specific, and to be easier applied. So it says, act in accordance with maxims of universally legislative member for a merely possible realm of ends. In other words, we must think that we we are not the only ones, no, who have maxim. For example, I don't only have the maxims. I am not only the one who is capable of producing maxims. There are other people, and each of us has its own maxims. Each of us has its own rational will, and to be in a world where there are other people, we must also keep in mind, since all of us have their own ends, since all of us should be used not merely as means but as an end in ourselves, we must always keep in mind that our maxims are to be enacted upon within a realm of ends. To include everyone, in other words, to keep in mind that everyone has its own rational will and that everyone is capable of producing maxims. Good maxims, not bad maxims. Okay? So that is uh, the whole point of the categorical imperative of Kant. And again, we can only understand Kant's categorical imperative by keeping in mind that everyone has autonomous power over oneself. All of us has rational will, and that this rational will can have the power to make our own maxims in becoming universal laws. Okay? Thank you for listening.